lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we will continue our examination of the question of the meaning of life. And as you can see from the title of this video, the final destination will be to have a consideration of, do we need to have God or the presence of some divine being in order for our lives to be meaningful? And more particularly, tracking the distinction we discussed last video, do we need God to have a life that is objectively meaningful? However, before there, I want to return to the article from Richard Taylor. Because you'll recall that last time we discussed how, in Taylor's view, there are these two types of meaning, objective meaning and subjective meaning. Objective meaning occurs when your action or the project you're engaging in or your life as a whole is headed towards some objectively or inherently valuable end. Right? Whatever it is that your life is oriented toward, whatever your life is meant to accomplish, that end is valuable in and of itself. And what we saw Taylor argue is that for biological life in general and human life in particular, he doesn't think objective meaning is possible. This is in part, for a number of reasons. First, if you just think about all your accomplishments specifically, everything you accomplish, anything the people you know accomplish, anything the species as a whole will accomplish, will ultimately be destroyed. It will ultimately end. It's finite, it's atemporal, it's a contingent thing. So if you make some great scientific discovery, it might help many people, but eventually those people will cease to exist. Everyone will forget about it. You build a great civilization, eventually that civilization will crumble and it will be in ruins. Anything you can create will not last forever. And so there's a sense in which the ultimate end of your actions is that very destruction. And he says, if you take a look at biological life itself, what you see is not a significant culmination or an ultimate final end which justifies the whole enterprise. You just see biological life, as he says, is a vast machine feeding on itself. One generation perpetuates the next generation, reproduces the next generation, etc., and it's unclear where any of this is going. So Taylor concludes that for human beings, we can't have a life that is objectively meaningful because nothing we accomplish lasts, and the only real purpose just seems to be to produce more human life. But of course, this brings up a second question. And Taylor wants to ask, well, okay, let's say objective meaning is impossible. What about subjective meaning? Which you'll recall is the sort of meaning we get not from the end we accomplish, but from the extent to which that end is satisfying to us, is fulfilling to us. Right? It's more about a subjective point of view. And so we should recall the myth of Sisyphus example. You'll remember that Taylor said, well, we can imagine that if Sisyphus was doing all the same things, pushing the boulder up the mountain over and over again for all eternity, but if he had a certain state of mind while doing it, if the gods implanted in him a strange and irrational impulse such that the only thing he wanted to do was push boulders up a mountain, if that was the case, then there might be some sort of meaning in his life, even if when you think about the end or purpose he's accomplishing, he's not really accomplishing anything significant. So he says here, but here we need to note something else that has been mentioned, but its significance not explored, and that is the state of mind and feeling with which such labors are undertaken. We noted that if Sisyphus had a keen and unappeasable desire to be doing just what he found himself doing, then although his life would in no way be changed, it would nevertheless have a meaning for him. And maybe this is the key to finding meaning in human life. At least this is Taylor's claim. He's going to say there is no ultimate purpose to human life, but we can find value and meaning in our lives depending on the way in which we look at our lives. We can find value and meaning in our life from a subjective point of view. Now, to argue that this is the way we should look at meaning, he again returns to this Sisyphus example. And he says, if you think carefully about the Sisyphus example, we can actually see that maybe subjective meaning is better than objective meaning. So he says, let us suppose that without having any interest in rolling stones as such, and finding this in fact a galling toil, Sisyphus did nevertheless have a deep interest in raising a temple, one that would be beautiful and lasting. Okay, so we're imagining that in this case, the gods have told him, you have to roll these stones up the hill to build this beautiful and lasting temple. And Sisyphus doesn't like stones, but he does want the temple to be built. So his whole life is oriented around providing the raw materials necessary to build this temple. And Taylor continues, let us suppose he succeeded in this, that after ages of dreadful toil, all directed this final result, he did at last complete his temple, such that now he could say his work was done and he could rest and forever enjoy the result. So he says, look, now the temple's built, so now I am done with my task, I've accomplished my point and meaning in life, and so now, of course, the question is, well, now what? What picture now presents itself to our minds? It is precisely the picture of infinite boredom, of Sisyphus doing nothing ever again, but contemplating what he has already wrought and can no longer add anything to, and contemplating it for an eternity. Now in this picture we have a meaning for Sisyphus' existence, a point for his prodigious labor because we have put it there. Yet at the same time, that which is really worthwhile seems to have slipped away entirely. Where before we were presented with the nightmare of eternal and pointless activity, we are now confronted with the hell of its eternal absence. So we imagine Sisyphus achieves his goal that he's long sought after for many years, rolling these stones up a hill. The beautiful temple is built, and now what does Sisyphus have to do? Well, nothing except enjoy his temple. And now we think back to our lessons on immortality and the idea of boredom. At first we can see Sisyphus might very well enjoy what he has created. But over time, that sort of unspeakable, unbearable boredom that we previously discussed would have to set in. And this is why Taylor says the only thing really worse than having to do this repetitive activity forever would be to have nothing to do forever. And the point he's making here is a general one about what is more important in our lives. Is it really the end we are seeking? Is it our goals? Is it our ultimate purpose? Or is it, as we might say, the journey, the actions we take, the activity or the process of getting to our destination? And we can all think of examples like this where you have some goal in mind and you accomplish that goal, and at the end of the day, it's not as satisfying as you thought it would be. I can give an example from my own life, right? So when I first began trying to publish scholarly articles in philosophy, it was really a sole goal, a singular goal of mine that I was going to do this. And I submitted some papers, got some rough feedback, got rejected, kept working, and over a number of years, finally got to the point where I was ready and I was able to submit a submission to a journal and have it accepted. And finally, my goal had been achieved. I felt vindicated for all the bad feedback I got in the past, for all, in my mind, thinking to myself, oh, there's so many people who didn't think I could do it, and here I've achieved and accomplished my goal. And the first thing I noticed was it wasn't nearly as satisfying as I thought it would be. I was happy to have the submission accepted, and I've done it other times after that, but it didn't give me the sort of fulfillment I thought it would. In fact, there's a certain sense in which the activity or the pursuit of the goal was actually more satisfying, more interesting, and more fulfilling than actually achieving the goal. And this is exactly what Taylor's trying to get at. Maybe the meaning in our life doesn't come from the end, but it comes from the means, it comes from the process. And this is where subjective meaning comes in. Instead of focusing on the end or result, focus on taking real true joy and having passion for the process and getting you there. So he gives another example. He says, well, if the builders of a great and flourishing ancient civilization could somehow return now to see archaeologists unearthing the trivial remnants of what they had once accomplished with such effort, see the fragments of pots and vases, a few broken statues, and such tokens of another age and greatness, they can indeed ask themselves what the point of it all was, if this is all it finally came to. So, you imagine a great civilization now gone extinct. They somehow are resurrected from the dead. They can see what is left of their civilization. Of course, it's just remains. It's just ruins, right? And so you might look at that and you might say, well, So we went through all that work, all that effort, and then, hundreds of years later, it's just all destroyed and sitting in ruins, and now all it's good for is people to go on tours and see it on vacation? But looked at from another point of view, they still might not see their effort wasted. Because Taylor says it did not seem so to them. It didn't at the time seem like this was wasted effort. For it was just the building and not what was finally built that gave their life meaning. And perhaps there's a general lesson here. If ultimately it's not the end or the result that matters, but it's the activity or process that can give our lives meaning, then what we should really focus on is, how are we engaging in the activities and processes of our lives? Are we doing so in a lethargic way? Are we doing so in a way where we're not really invested in what we're doing? Or do you have a set of projects, goals, or you might even say, reaching back to a previous lesson, do you have certain categorical desires, categorical goals that give you a reason to push forward? And even if at the end of the day, whatever you create will be destroyed, whatever you create will be long forgotten after many years, if you truly find a passion and desire to do those things, then perhaps that's what's most important. And so another way he describes this is their endless activity. Now actually talking about the glowworms, but of course he says, apply this to the life of a nation, a species, the life of the world in general. The endless activity of these beings, which gets nowhere, is just what it is their will to pursue. This is its whole justification and meaning. So those glowworms who we said, well, it seems rather odd to live a life where you're simply just waiting for your next bit of nourishment. And there is something odd about that, right? To think that this is all that is going on in your life. Every moment is just oriented toward survival in the next moment. But notice for the glowworm, that's what is their will to pursue. That is their nature. That is in fact what drives them forward. And although it wouldn't seem a satisfying, fulfilling life to us, who's to say that for them, that's not what life is all about? And for a human being, because we do have these higher mental capacities that we can look in our life and place value on things, we might say, well, for a human being, what matters is also just doing what it is our will to pursue. What matters is finding that which engages your passion, which engages your desires, which you think has fundamental importance. And so at the end of the day, it won't matter what you pursue, it's the way in which you pursue it. And that's why he thinks the idea that the modification where Sisyphus has a strange and irrational impulse to roll boulders up hills, for Taylor, Sisyphus in that case has all the meaning that life can have. If Sisyphus truly did enjoy rolling those boulders up the hill, and that was his passion, and that was his every desire, then who's to say his life is meaningless? If in fact we think the activity or process is more important than the end or result. And he sums this up in the very last passage of the article, and really encouraging us to look at life in this particular way. He says, you no sooner drew your first breath than you responded to the will that was in you to live. You no more ask whether it will be worthwhile or whether any significance will come of it than the worms and the birds. The point of living is simply to be living in the manner that it is your nature to be living. And I don't think he's just talking about human nature there. Partly he is, right? You should live life as a human being, but you should also live life according to your nature as a person. Whatever your passion is, whatever your desire is, whatever gets you up in the morning and gets you moving, that is the way you live a meaningful life. The true enemy to a meaningful life is not reflection on the fact that there is no ultimate purpose to life. The real enemy to living a meaningful life is not being able to find something that you care about. It's not being able to find a project that gets you up in the morning and motivates you to work with intense desire and passion. And so for that reason, he says, the meaning of life is from within us. It is not bestowed from without, and it far exceeds in both its beauty and permanence any heaven of which men have ever dreamed or yearned for. Now that last statement is very important because what he's saying is meaning comes from you, and not from anything outside of yourself. And furthermore, there's certainly allusions to some of the religious answers where meaning is often said to come from. He said the meaning that can come from simply yourself is better and more permanent and more beautiful than any heaven which men have ever dreamed or yearned for. And earlier in the essay, he brought this point up as well. Right? Because look, Taylor might be satisfied with the idea that human life lacks objective meaning, but if we look at it the right way, it can have subjective meaning. But if we look at the various religions of the world, even the various philosophies of the world, what they show to us that there really is a deep desire for some more permanent, maybe more lasting meaning that you can find outside of yourself. Taylor notices this. He says, our religions proclaiming a heaven that does not crumble, their hymnals and prayer books declaring a significance to life, of which our eyes provide no hint whatever. Even our philosophies portray some permanent and lasting goods at which all may aim, from the changeless forms invented by Plato to the beatific vision of St. Thomas. Now, we should recall here, when we discussed Plato earlier in the course, remember he has this theory of forms, that there is this realm of reality which is eternal and changeless and lasts forever, and essentially our purpose in life is to use philosophy, use philosophical reasoning to reunite with the forms. Now, Plato may have his philosophical reason for thinking the forms exist, but at the same time, we can see how it serves a psychological need. When we look around and we know everything we accomplish will crumble, every society we build will be destroyed, nothing will last forever, there can be a deep yearning in the human being to want something that's lasting. When he talks about the beatific vision of St. Thomas, he's talking about St. Thomas Aquinas, the famous Catholic philosopher and theologian, who felt that he held that the purpose of a human life is this union with God. And what does a union with God gives us? It gives us a permanent, lasting sort of joy and happiness. It's an accomplishment that can never be taken away. It's not a temporal thing of this world. Now, it's clear from Taylor's comments here that he thinks that these sort of things are invented. He doesn't believe in Plato's forms. He doesn't seem to believe in the idea of a union of God as St. Thomas Aquinas describes it. And he admits that there is a need served by these things, but he thinks they're just fictions. And ultimately, as we've seen, he thinks we can get all the meaning we need from life subjectively by pursuing our projects with passion. But I think it's worth thinking about whether he's right about this. And specifically now, I want to get to the topic or this discussion of, is subjective meaning really enough? Or do we need some objective source of meaning? And if we do need an objective source of meaning, do we need to find that in a divine being like God? Now, one philosopher who thinks that in order to have any real meaning in our lives, we need God, is the famous theologian and philosopher William Lane Craig. And what's interesting about Craig is that he actually would agree with Taylor to a certain extent. He does think without God, it's very much the case that our lives lack any objective meaning. And he describes this in the following way. Scientists tell us that everything in the universe is growing farther and farther apart. As it does so, the universe grows colder and its energy is used up. Eventually, all the stars will burn out and all matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes. There will be no light at all. There will be no heat. There will be no life, only the corpses of dead stars and galaxies, ever expanding into the endless darkness and the cold recesses of space, a universe in ruins. This is not science fiction. The entire universe marches irreversibly toward its grave. So not only is the life of each individual person doomed, the entire human race is doomed. The universe is plunging toward inevitable extinction. Death is written through its structure. There is no escape. There is no hope. Now, to be clear, Craig is a theist. He believes in God, and he doesn't actually think there is no escape, there is no hope. What he is saying is that without God, there's no escape, there's no hope. There is no meaning to our life. Because as Taylor has pointed out, everything is finite, everything is temporal, everything comes to an end, everything will be destroyed that is made by any human being or the human race as a whole. So what Craig uses this idea to do is to argue that if we want to have meaning in our life, we need something like God. And here I'm going to consider two different arguments that would move you in that direction. Both of these are discussed in the reading you did by Eric Weilenberg, who outlines them and provides some discussion of them. So the first of these arguments he calls the final outcome argument. So we can outline this argument in the following way. P1. A human being's life can only be objectively meaningful if the final outcome of that human being's life is itself valuable. So let's think about this premise. This premise is basically just saying, if you want objective meaning in your life, then whatever the final outcome of your life is, that final outcome has to be valuable. Right? And what do we mean by final outcome? We just mean like the final purpose, the final end, the final result that you think all your actions are bringing about. And Weilenberg explains this point in the following way. He says, suppose we think of a person's life as a series of events. Some of these events are brought about by the individual, others caused by external forces. But, goes the argument, the value of the series of events depends entirely on the value of the very last state of affairs to which that series causally contributes. If the final outcome is valuable, then the events that led up to and contribute to it may have value. If that final state of affairs is devoid of value, then similarly all events that led up to it are worthless. So the idea is whatever the final end or result of your life is, that's what gives meaning and purpose to your life. And if you're having a hard time understanding why that would be, consider the following example. Let's say you were going to run a race. And okay, so you train, you get ready, you're at the starting line, and everyone's ready to go, you're warmed up, and then they tell you right when you get to the starting line, okay, so we're making one change. There's going to be no end to this race. Right? You're going to be running in this race for all of eternity, or at least until you die. Now, there are a number of reasons why once told that you would probably not run the race. One would be you have other things to do. You don't want to spend the rest of your life just running until your body can no longer support your life. That's all true. But there's a philosophical reason why it would make zero sense to start a race like that. If you knew at the very outset of the race that there was no end, that we were never going to determine who the winner was, that all your training that you put forth was never going to help you complete the race, if there was no purpose to the race, then why begin? It seemed, if you think about a race, the entire value of the race is determined by the result, because everyone runs the race, we see what your time is, and the faster your time is, the better you did. But if we're not seeing who wins, if we're not taking time, if we're not seeing how fast you ran, then what's the point of the race in the first place? And so then apply this to your life. If you knew at the outset that your life isn't going anywhere, it has no fundamental purpose, there's no final result that matters, then why should you begin living in the first place? And that just is to ask the question of, what reason do I have to go on with my life? There's a real fundamental way in which it might seem that in order to have a reason to live, a reason to continue existing, you need to think that there's some fundamental purpose that matters to your life. And this is what P1 is saying. Okay, so P1 says a human being's life can only be objectively meaningful if the final outcome is valuable. P2, if God doesn't exist, then the final outcome of no human being's life can itself be valuable. So why is this, right? I mean, it's one thing to claim that, look, and Taylor would agree, that our lives can't be objectively meaningful if there's no valuable final outcome. But how does God give us a final valuable outcome? Well, traditionally, God has been associated in a religious point of view with an afterlife. Right, Weilenberg goes on to explain, without God, every human life terminates with the grave and the annihilation of the conscious self. The last outcome to which any human life contributes is an utterly static, lifeless, extropic, frozen universe. Such an outcome is devoid of value, it follows, because all human lives are entirely devoid of value. Right? If you know that the only state of affairs, the only final result your life is contributing to is your death, and there's no life after that, and you know the only state of affairs the life of the human species as a whole is contributing to is the death of the species in a completely lifeless universe, then it doesn't seem that there's any final valuable outcome. As Weilenberg puts it, in a godless universe that ends with a whimper, no human life is worth living. Craig also supports this point, and he makes the following analogy, which I think is interesting. If there is no God, then man and the universe are doomed, like prisoners condemned to death row. We stand and simply wait for our unavoidable execution. If there is no God and there is no immortality, then what is the consequence of this? He says if God doesn't exist and there is no afterlife, then we're just heading towards our destruction. He describes us like prisoners condemned to an execution. And there's a couple of points to make about that. One, it does seem similar to Plato's idea that in fact we are prisoners to our body and that death is the release which sets our soul free. So there's certainly some shades of that in here. But of course we might also say, well, are we really like prisoners? Because granted, we're like prisoner awaiting execution in that we will die. But the thing about a prisoner is that they don't normally enjoy themselves while in prison. It's a punishment. But in our lives, we get plenty of enjoyment. We get plenty of pleasure. So I think it's important to realize here that Craig's perspective is completely diametrically opposed to that of Taylor. Taylor says what really matters is having passion and enjoyment and doing things you love and care about. And if you enjoy the activities you engage in your life, if they give you pleasure, that can give you meaning. But if Craig thinks that this life is like a prisoner awaiting execution, then he must at minimum think that the pleasure and enjoyment and the activities we do now must not have much value. I mean, it's good to be happy, but what really matters is if there is no ultimate valuable final outcome, if all we're going to do at the end is die and have the cessation of our experience, then maybe we had a good time while we were here. But it's not going anywhere. And if it's not going anywhere, we can't fundamentally have meaning. To a large extent, this tracks that distinction I made in the first video on this topic between being happy and satisfied and living pleasantly and having a meaningful life. So in any case, if you accept those two premises, then the conclusion we get is that if God does not exist and there's no afterlife, then human beings cannot lead lives that are objectively meaningful. Now, at this point, there's a further issue that needs to be discussed. Specifically, if you again recall back to our lesson on immortality, one of the things we came away with there is that mere immortal existence, merely existing forever, doesn't necessarily give us the kind of life we want. And in fact, we see that Craig himself agrees with this. He says, mere duration of existence does not make that existence meaningful. If man and the universe could exist forever, but if there were no God, their existence would still not have ultimate significance. And one of the reasons he gives for this is that he again highlights how existing forever could just lead to boredom if we have nothing to do, if there's no fundamental reason for living. And so even if it is the case that we exist forever, our life has to have a certain sort of purpose, he thinks, given by God to be meaningful. So it's not just immortality man needs if life is to be ultimately significant. He needs God and immortality. And this brings up a second argument on this question of God and the meaning of life. And Weilenberg discusses this argument. He calls it, perhaps depressingly, the nobody of significance cares argument. And he uses the following quotation that comes from the philosopher Susan Wolf. It's not actually her argument, she rejects it, but she gives the following, I think, good description of it. Susan Wolf says, on the view of these philosophers, a life can be meaningful only if it can mean something to someone. And not just to someone, but to someone other than oneself, and indeed someone of more intrinsic or ultimate value than oneself. She continues, if a life that is devoted solely to yourself, a life that is good to no one other than yourself lacks meaning, these philosophers not implausibly think, so will a life that is devoted to any other poor creature. For he or she will have no more objective importance than you have. and so will be no more fit a stopping place by which to ground the claim of meaningfulness than you. If each life has but an infinitesimal amount of value, then although one's meaning will increase in proportion to one's effect, the total quantity of meaning relative to the cosmos will remain so small as to make the effort pathetic. Now, the basic idea behind this argument is that it's not enough just that we live forever, but there has to be someone, some being, some individual that cares about the things that we do. There has to be some individual outside of ourselves that thinks that the actions we take are significant. And this is the basis for the second argument, which again, Weilenberg calls the nobody of significance cares argument, and I'm outlining in the following way. So premise 1, a human being's life can only have objective meaning if that human being's life matters, 1, to some other individual, that 2, is of more intrinsic or ultimate value than oneself. And we should consider both aspects of that premise. So first, I'm going to call this the external approval condition. It's the idea that a life can only be meaningful if you're not the only one who cares about it. So there you are, pursuing some goal. And you might think, well, if you're just pursuing a goal that only you care about, if you're just living for yourself, if it's nothing that a family member, a friend, your society, your community, your country cares about, or if it doesn't benefit them in any way, then we might say, well, simply living for yourself doesn't seem like enough to make one's life meaningful. So you need some sort of external approval. Again, this is what Taylor would reject. He does very much see meaning coming from within ourselves. He says explicitly this is the case. But if that seems selfish, if that seems egoistic, if that seems small-minded and narrow-minded, then we might think, yeah, well, your life should be about something greater outside of yourself, bigger than yourself. Now, there's also a second aspect to that premise. Not only does your life need to matter to some other individual, but that other individual needs to be of more intrinsic or ultimate value than you. So the idea, and I'm going to call this the significant approval condition, the idea is that whoever it is that cares about your life, that thinks what you're doing is significant, that thinks it matters, that benefits from it, that thinks it's a good thing, must be of greater value than you. And here I think it might take a little more explanation as to why that is the case. Right, so first consider this. We often say that all human beings are fundamentally equal in some sense. That in some way, in terms of our moral value, I'm no more important than you and you're no more important than me. And we also said that it's not enough that just you care about your life, because it's not enough just to live for yourself. But, and we saw this in the quote from Susan Wolf above, if it's not enough that you care about your life, and it is also the case that you're equal to anyone else, then how can your life be valuable just because your friends care about it? Just because your family cares about it? Just because other people care about it? If all people are equal, then their approval should not be any more important than your own self-approval. And so then we get the second premise of the argument. So we've had this idea that for your life to be meaningful, it has to matter to someone else, and it has to matter to someone else who has more ultimate importance or intrinsic value than you have. And P2 says, well, if God doesn't exist, then no human being's life can matter to some other individual that has more intrinsic or ultimate value than you. Now, why is this? Well, you say, look, if there is no God, if there is no ultimate divine being that's of a higher status than human beings, then the only other being your life can matter to is other humans. And we just said that all humans are fundamentally equal in some sense. And that means no other human being's approval is really more important than the approval you give to yourself. So if we're going to find a way in which our lives can have sort of ultimate or intrinsic value, if we're going to find a way in which our lives can have an ultimate purpose, we need to find some ultimate, higher being that can approve of our lives. And P2 says the only way in which we can find such a being, the only way in which our lives can gain that sort of approval is, in fact, if God exists. Because God, unlike other human beings, is more important, is more valuable, is of a higher nature than we are. So if you put those two premises together, you get the conclusion, if God does not exist, then human beings cannot lead lives that are objectively meaningful. Now, I think this argument really gets at, in a deep, fundamental way, why it is common to think there's a connection between living a meaningful life and the existence of God. So I'll be very curious to hear what you have to think about it. And there are a number of questions you should keep in mind here. One, do you think that our lives need to have the approval of someone else to be meaningful? Or like Taylor, is it enough that we approve of them ourselves? Another thing to think about is, let's suppose that it's also true that whatever approval of our lives we need to give them ultimate significance, to give them objective meaning, has to come from a being that's more important than ourselves. Another question is, do we actually need to go all the way to God? Like, granted, if maybe just a few of your friends approve of your life, then maybe that's not that much different than you just living for yourself. But is there anything in between, right? Just you caring about your life, or just the people you know caring about your life? And going all the way to a supreme being like God caring about your life? Is there anything in between those two extremes which could approve of your actions, your projects, and make them significant in a real fundamental lasting way without going all the way to a being like God? So those are some questions to think about with this argument. As I said, I'll be very interested to hear what you have to say. I will cut this video here. I hope it's been helpful, and I will see you in the next video.